Greetings, fellow bookworms. Ready to embark on a wild adventure into a magical realm? You're in luck. Welcome back to my channel, the go-to place for all things fantastical. Today, we're diving into the magical world of Troll Hunter Witch for Hire, the prequel to the Gretchen's Misadventures series by P.A. Mason. In this enchanting tale, join us as we follow a witch like no other on her quest to navigate the whimsical world of trolls, magic, and maybe a few mishaps along the way. So, grab your favourite potion, beverage, and settle in for a ride full of spellbinding twists and turns. Before we leap into this magical journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and share your favourite magical creatures in the comments below. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. Gretchen hummed a tune as she bottled the last of her wart serum and stacked them in her pantry. It had been a quiet week, but she knew stocking up now would save her trouble when the first chills of winter rolled around, and she'd be up to her eyeballs in runny noses. Mulligan edged closer to the cauldron and took a tentative sniff of the dregs at the bottom. "I'd mind your tongue, Mulligan. That brew is meant for killing stubborn warts, and with your temperament it might vanquish you altogether. Remember what happened last time you poked around in one of my potions? You're a lot less purple than you used to be, but I'm the only one who thinks the colour suits you." Gretchen barked a laugh, and the feline hissed. She swung the cauldron on its hook and grabbed a cloth when the bell by the door rang out. She spun on her heel with a grin. "Customers, Mulligan!" Wiping her hands, she scurried over and swung the door open with what she hoped was a polite smile. A waif of a girl with an unfortunately large nose stood on her threshold, wringing her hands. "Can I help you, kid?" The girl licked her lips and her eyes darted. Gretchen smiled knowingly and cackled. "A love potion, I see. Who is the unfortunate soul?" The girl recoiled with a scowl and turned her nose in the air. "Never you mind, witch. Can you help or not?" Gretchen tapped the side of her nose and winked. "I brew the finest love potion this side of the river, guaranteed to have them drooling all the way to the altar." The girl pressed her lips together and looked her up and down. "How much?" Gretchen leaned against the doorframe and rubbed her chin while calculating. 3 gold coins. The ingredients are hard to come by." The girl's jaw dropped, and she took a step back. 3? For a brew that might not even work? Gretchen snickered and waved a hand. "Girl, you should see the fellas lined up at my door on a Friday night. Why, witches don't keep brooms just for flying, you know. They come in real handy when you need to start batting them away with a stick, with their poems scribbled in notebooks and bunches of flowers." The girl's eyes widened, and Gretchen frowned as she scampered away around the back of the house. She leaned around her porch to get a better view of the road. 3 men marched toward the house, and if Gretchen wasn't mistaken, one of them was the mayor. Her house wasn't on the way to anywhere in particular, and when they turned to open her garden gate, she couldn't believe her luck. 4 customers in one day, providing the kid didn't skedaddle. "How can I help you fine gentlemen today?" The mayor stepped forward, and the other 2 lingered by the gate. One of them she was sure was the mayor's son, and the other looked like a farmer. When she tried a friendly smile, only the son returned the gesture. "Ah, yes. The town requires your services, madam. We seem to have an infestation problem." His lip curled, and Gretchen nodded slowly. "Right. The, lice kind? Or perhaps something a little more personal?" The mayor bristled, and he glowered at her. "Not on our persons. This fine citizen," he waved a hand at the farmer, "has a troll that has taken up residence under a bridge by his farm." "It's eating our cattle," the farmer piped up. "A troll?" Gretchen frowned. "I don't think I have a potion for that. Wouldn't a hunter be more fitting in this kind of situation?" The mayor coughed, and his son waved a hand to silence the farmer. "We tried that. Didn't work." Gretchen leaned back where she stood and held a hand up. "Whoa now! You want me to sort out a troll who gave one of your biggest and burliest a thrashing? We thought it best that it's dealt with by one of your kind." The mayor didn't bother to conceal his disdain. "He may be more inclined to trust you. It's simply a matter of slipping him some of your rat poison and the matter will be concluded. Or," Gretchen raised her eyebrows, "I go down there and he fancies a witch sandwich. The mayor clapped his hands together and drew a deep breath. "We can make it well worth your while. The price of the cattle that creature has consumed has put quite the dent in the economy. Why, I can barely afford a side of beef. Me, the mayor! Worth my while, eh?" Gretchen considered her mounting debts. "I should hope so if it's a bounty hunter you're after." "Splendid." The mayor clamped her hand in a firm shake and turned on his heel. "I trust you'll make this your top priority. 20 gold coins. The reward will diminish with each beast that goes missing from now on." Gretchen opened her mouth to argue, but the mayor was already closing the garden gate behind him. She clicked her teeth shut as the men turned down the road, and only the mayor's son tipped his hat to her with a commiserative smile. She'd heard nice things about that boy. Odd things too, but she wasn't one to judge. Her mind snapped back to attention. Trolls, big, hairy, stinking. "Are they gone?" came a hiss from around the side of the cottage. "All clear, kid." The girl rounded the corner with eyes darting and stood away from the door, puffing herself up. "I'll give you 2 gold coins, and I want the potion in 3 days. Gretchen let out a low whistle and put her hands on her hips. "Now see, I'm not sure that's possible. Seems I have a troll on my hands, and you haven't even provided me with a lock of this fella's hair." The girl's eyes widened and her shoulders slumped. "Why do you need that?" Gretchen waggled her fingers and winked. "I'll need some of yours too. It's how the magic happens, if you want him to fall for you." "Fine." She heaved a sigh. "I'll be back tomorrow." Gretchen shrugged and turned, her mind already on the bigger problem. She bumped the door closed with her hip and scurried over to her windows to tug the curtains closed, leaving her cottage bathed in firelight. Kneeling by a rug, she folded it over and pried up a loose floorboard to reach into the cavity below. She hauled out a leather-bound tome and carried it to her desk, holding it at arm's length. Mulligan meowed from an overstuffed chair and stalked across it to leap onto the desk with accusing eyes. When Gretchen dropped the book beside him, he hissed and backed away. "Desperate times, furball. Unless you know how to take out trolls." She clucked. "Nope, didn't think so." The spellbook stretched against its restraints, wobbling the rickety table and dismissing Mulligan altogether. Gretchen levelled a finger with a stern look. "Trolls. I need something to get rid of trolls. No nonsense, no party tricks. Any more of those fireworks, and I'll throw you in the hearth myself." The book settled, and Gretchen gingerly untied its laces. With a hand firmly planted on its cover, she closed her eyes and drew a deep breath through her nose. The book caught her off guard and snapped open, its pages whipping by and its contents spewing into the air. Random words hung suspended in front of her eyes, along with animated drawings which wriggled up the walls. "Enough!" Gretchen thumped the desk, and the spells settled back in their volume. "Now, troll eradication, if you will." Pages turned more slowly, the words on each page shifting too fast to form a coherent passage. When the pages slowed to a stop, it left Gretchen staring at a blank page. "What do you call this?" She threw her hands up. "You finally conceding you don't have all the answers?" A stick figure walked onto the page and trod across the spine over the other side. It flipped her the bird before leaving her view entirely, and Gretchen scoffed. "All right then, back in the hole it is." The book rattled, its pages once more in a flurry of activity, and Gretchen smirked despite herself. With a hum of concentration, the pages snapped closed, then sprang open to rest on a section with tightly scrawled instructions and lists of ingredients. "Now that's more like it." Gretchen rubbed her chin and narrowed her eyes. 4 potions? But that looks like a brew to take care of sweet itch, an antipsychotic, a remembering tonic. I've never even seen the last one. Care to give that one a name? The words began to fade, and Gretchen snatched up her quill to scribble a copy into her notebook. When she set it aside to let the ink dry, the spellbook was slumbering, its pages blank. "Well, I don't fancy my chances of taking out a troll with any of those, Mulligan." The cat glared at her from under the sofa and resumed bathing himself. Gretchen scrubbed a hand over her face. "Well, I'll be damned if I'm going in blind." She fetched her cloak from its hook and tied her key to her belt. "I'll bet Nora has an idea or two. Her spellbook isn't half as belligerent as mine." Chapter 2. The Salton Bog was quiet that early, and old Thomas was scraping up last night's mess from the floor when Gretchen barged in. Holding her nose against the smell, she nodded to the old publican and crossed to her usual corner where Nora sat, face planted to the table. "Yoo-hoo! You know it's barely past noon, don't you?" Gretchen tilted her head. The only response was a snore which turned to a snort before Nora's breathing slowed to the rhythmic pace of deep slumber. "She's been here since last night." Gretchen turned to Thomas, who leaned on his broom. The elderly dwarf's pallor was sickly, and bags hung under his eyes. He'd been the custodian of the Salton Bog, whose patrons weren't welcome among regular folks, as long as Gretchen could remember. "Thomas, take a seat, old friend. You look like death's familiar." She scooted a chair toward him and took the broom and dustpan from his grasp. "You lot will be the death of me." He sank to the chair with a wince. "Nellie left last week, finally got accepted into that academy she was always talking about." Gretchen frowned. It explained the smell. The brownie was industrious when it came to cleaning up after the rowdier customers. But if she got yammering, she would tell anyone who'd listen that she would be an actress one day. "A brownie in an actors' guild? I hope she doesn't get her knickers in a twist when they cast her as an imp." Gretchen scratched her head and felt Thomas's forehead. "Quit your poking and prodding. I'll be just fine." Thomas swatted at her hand. "You want to be of real use? You can help me get this place in order before the riffraff gets here." Gretchen sighed at the surly old timer and held her hands up. "Fine, but you sit right there while I make you a pot of tea. I'll set this tap room right in a jiffy." The dwarf grumbled an assent, and Gretchen scooted behind the bar to the storeroom and kitchen out the back. The smell there was more pungent, and Gretchen uncorked a barrel and took a tentative whiff. "No wonder there's more vomit than usual." She jammed the cork back with a wince. "He's trying to poison us all." Humming a tune, she put the kettle on to boil and washed a set of stained crockery salvaged from the sink overrun with filthy dishes. Fishing a small corked vial out of her pouch, she added a healthy dose to the teapot and poured hot water to steep. She carried the tray back to the taproom and poured a cup for the dwarf before taking stock of the situation. "A week, you say? This place looks like it's seen the end times. No wonder with sour ale. Not that something like that would stop those chumps from drinking it." The dwarf spluttered over his tea, and his bushy eyebrows knitted together. "There's nothing wrong with my ale. This establishment is top rate. A quick sweep and a little dusting. Okay, fine, let me handle it. But promise me you'll find someone to give you a hand around here." She tittered as Thomas yawned. "Take your tea and go upstairs for a lie down. It'll be a couple of hours before the usual suspects start dropping in." The dwarf muttered thanks and tramped up the narrow staircase with bleary eyes. "I'm worried about him." Gretchen turned to Nora, who had her head propped in her hands. "Says she who sleeps till noon in a tavern with a table for a pillow." Gretchen put her hands on her hips. "Well, I couldn't leave him like that, could I?" She yawned. "Those beasts would eat him alive. I'm surprised they stayed as long as they did after I tinkered with the ale barrels. You did that? Well, I'm not going to scrape up all this puke by myself. On your feet, soldier." Nora guffawed and stood to stretch as Gretchen returned the tea tray to the kitchen. Without her usual charms to help with the chores, scrubbing the putrid dishes was hard graft. Her hands were scalded and wrinkled when she was done with the sink, and she muttered a curse at the absent brownie. Drying her hands on one of the cleaner dish towels, she sniffed the air as she trod back to the bar. "Sandalwood?" Nora sat with a newspaper spread in front of her as an animated broom did a circuit of the floors. The stench had dissipated, and a mop encroached where the broom left off. "I brought some of my things over a few days ago. Doing it by hand was getting tiresome." Gretchen wiped down the bar and cleared empty bottles away, wondering what other enchanted items Nora had lying around. "And doesn't the Baron care about your absence from his estate?" Gretchen failed to keep the bitterness from her tone. "That old geezer?" Nora cackled. "The only spell he's interested in is the one his new mistress has him under." Gretchen pushed away resentment. Being a witch on a stipend with the Blue Bloods was cushy. There were only so many nobles who could afford the luxury. Nora got the job based solely on her reputation for hexes. "Well, you should use your time to find a replacement for Nellie." Gretchen uncorked a bottle of brandy and gave it a sniff before pouring 2 small tots. "What do you think I'm doing?" she snapped. I've been checking the classifieds every day. Finding a helper willing to deal with these fiends is harder than you think." "Unlikely," Gretchen muttered as she sank to the stool beside her. "Classifieds? Isn't that what regular folks use?" "I've exhausted all other options. Apparently cleaning up around here isn't the dream job for magical types. Even the mines pay more than Thomas." Gretchen blinked and imagined a gnome waiting tables and brokering peace among the ogres. "Well, this can't go on. Doesn't Thomas have a niece anywhere who can come help?" The sound of boots scraping by the door caught Gretchen's attention before it swung open. She groaned and stood whipping a dishcloth over her shoulder. "Now, we won't be having any guff today, I'll tell you. Try anything on with me, and I'll put a tincture in your drink that will have you scratching your nether regions for days." A young man sidled around the door with a quirked eyebrow. The doorway barely accommodated his wide shoulders, but there was more humour than outrage twinkling in his eye. "Not the kind of promise I expect when I walk into a tavern," he winked, "but I'll try anything once." Gretchen's cheeks burned. You must be new around these parts. This is the Salt and Bog, a watering hole for those of the magical persuasion." She clapped her hands and jerked a thumb behind her. "You'll be looking for the Miller's Inn further down." "Will I?" He ambled to the bar and pulled up a stool. "What if I told you I'm right where I want to be?" Gretchen guffawed and squeezed behind the bar. "I'd say that you need your head read, but I don't offer those services, so what'll you have?" "Ale, if you please." "You don't want the ale?" "I don't." He smirked. Gretchen reached under the bar and uncorked a bottle of brandy with her teeth. She poured a healthy dose and rolled her eyes when Nora called for another. "Tell you what, this one's on the house, so long as you promise not to make a mess." She slid the second glass down the bar, and Nora leapt from her chair to catch it before it tumbled. Gretchen grinned at the other witch's curses. "This is one of the strangest drinking establishments I've ever set foot in." He threw back his drink and turned the glass in his hand. "And you're one of the strangest normal people I've come across in a while." She refilled the glass and stowed the bottle back in its place. "What's your story, buddy?" "Gavin's the name. New in town. Set up shop at the old foundry as a silversmith." Gretchen gave an appreciative nod. "Silversmith, eh? So, not some kind of leper, then?" "It's worse than that." He propped his head in his hands. "I'm the most eligible bachelor in town." Gretchen cackled, and Nora chuckled into her newspaper. Gavin rolled his eyes and took another swig, while Gretchen dabbed at her cheeks with the dishcloth. "Quite the problem," she wheezed. "Choice fatigue? Are the ladies round here brandishing gloves calling challenges to all who glance your way?" "Those girls are harmless, if not my type," he sighed. "It's the mothers who are a nightmare. They're relentless. Can't understand why a man like me wouldn't have a wife and a horde of children running around the house already." "Well, we don't judge around here. If you want to marry a toad, I'm pretty sure we could find someone to officiate it. You can hide from the old busybodies here all you like." He gave a mock salute, and Gretchen sat the bottle on the bar beside him before trudging back to sit with Nora. She pushed the newspaper to the table with her finger and met the older witch's eye. "Now, I didn't come here to while away the afternoon playing barkeeper. I have a paying job, and I need your help." Nora tugged the newspaper free and folded it beside her. "Tell me this isn't like the time. I promise. This job came from the mayor himself. There's a problem with a troll, you see." Gretchen's teeth clicked shut as Nora shook her head and snickered. "They came to you? After what that monster did to their best huntsman? Even the Baron refused to send anyone. Said it was a municipal problem." Gretchen huffed. "Well, are you going to help me or not? Don't you have some kind of hex for this sort of thing?" Nora took a sip of brandy and smacked her lips. "Trolls are hardy creatures, mostly immune to magic. I'm not sure a hex would do much more than irritate it. Have you consulted with your spellbook?" Gretchen waved a hand and rolled her eyes. "You know what it's like. Insolent thing coughs up nonsense more often than not." She reached into her pouch to pull out the note she'd scrawled. "I can make no sense of this whatsoever." Nora pushed her spectacles further up her nose and held the note in front of her. Her brows knitted in concentration, and then confusion as she deciphered Gretchen's handwriting. "You need to get that book looked at. When was the last time you had it seen to at the library?" Gretchen heaved a sigh and hung her head in her hands. "I don't have that kind of coin. The folks around here are infuriatingly healthy. I haven't had a decent payday in months." Nora tittered and shook her head. "I don't know how many times I need to tell you to diversify. It's a witch-eat-witch world out there, much as it sickens me to say. There used to be a time when we would work together and not all jump when regular folks said, 'How high?' Why, if my great-grandmother were alive today—" Gretchen tuned out. Nora was about to get on her high horse, and once it got to that point, getting her back on track was impossible. She almost sighed with relief when the door crashed open, and the familiar sound of bickering gnomes filled the room. Yeah, look, you keep trying to track down a pair of helpful hands, and I'll take care of the rabble." Gretchen trudged back to the bar and cleared her throat. "Listen up, fellas. Gretchen's serving drinks tonight, and I'll take none of your usual shenanigans." Gavin chuckled from his stool, and the gnomes burst into fits of laughter. It was going to be a long night. Chapter 3. Reconnaissance, Mulligan. Just a quick flyby to see what we're dealing with. Gretchen hitched up her hose and strapped the potions to her belt. Against her better judgment, she'd brewed the recipes her spellbook had come up with just in case. After an evening spent settling squabbles with the business end of her broom, nothing more suitable had occurred to her. Mulligan gave a disinterested flick of his tail and rolled on his back to make the best use of sunlight streaming through his favourite window. "So I'm guessing you don't want to come with, then?" she snorted. "You're a poor excuse of a witch's familiar." She had a fair idea of where she would find the troll after making a few inquiries with the ogres last night. They'd shared what they'd heard from the slaughterhouses, passed along by nervous farmers bringing their beasts for butchering. Certain they'd embellished their stories, Gretchen brushed off the gnawing feeling in her belly and strode out the door. Her broom was in the bush where she left it after her last landing. Darn thing had a mind of its own, not least when on a downward trajectory. She yanked it clear of the tangle of thorns and gave it a shake for good measure. She got a gauge on the wind, sucking on her finger and holding it up on the air, before steeling herself for takeoff. At least it's a good day for it. She took a deep breath and took off down the worn path across her lawn, holding her broom at the correct angle. When her boot hit the familiar rut, she leapt into the air and swung her broom under her rump, its momentum already straining her arms. With a final haul upward, she barely missed her garden fence as they ascended. "Yahoo!" Gretchen grinned as the wind whipped her face, relieved to take off on the first try. She turned a circle around the cottage until she hit a comfortable thermal and kept the sun to her left as she headed south toward the rolling hills where farmers grazed their beasts. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and despite her quarry, she couldn't help but be in a cheerful mood. Her broom had taken her a little higher than she'd intended, so she leaned forward to edge downward, her eyes scanning the scenery below. Cattle looked like ants, and sturdy farmhouses and barns appeared as mushrooms crowded close to the split of land across the expanse of green. A stream, which branched from the Solar River, gave life to the vegetable gardens so far from town. It made sense that a troll would take up residence so close to the small community. Easy fodder. The broom handle thrummed in her grip as she steered downward, cannoning into a wind drift pushing the opposite way. Gretchen closed her eyes against the sting and rode out the turbulence to a patch further down where the air was still. She'd overshot her mark and turned to keep the stream in sight. After a few circuits, she spotted the small crossing, with little more than a cattle track on either side. The land sloped downward toward the stream, creating a sheltered valley to hide in. She saw no sign of the troll from her vantage. Trying her luck a little closer, she pushed down almost to ground level and dived into the valley further along. As she approached, her eyes widened when she saw a lone goat about to cross the ancient stone bridge, which seemed more like a pile of rocks since it was in such disrepair. The goat, with a mouthful of grass, chewed absently as it tottered onto the bridge, probably escaped from some farmer's flock. It showed no sign of wariness, and Gretchen was almost caught by surprise when an enormous hairy hand reached up to yank the poor creature down by the leg. She couldn't see the beast, sheltered as he was, but the ease with which it had snared the goat told Gretchen he had to be as large as an ogre. With a mind to her flight, she avoided a collision over a grassy hill and took her chances skimming against the ground to screech to a halt. The broom slipped out from under her and she hit the ground with a thump as the broom jolted ahead before dropping to the ground. Gretchen screwed up her nose, certain she'd landed directly on goat droppings from the aroma wafting from the dewy grass. "I've had worse landings," she grumbled. Pushing to her feet with a wince, she kept to a crouch as she tiptoed back to where the land sloped back down, wary of drawing attention until she got her bearings. She pulled her hat off for good measure and settled on her belly over the rise, squinting against the morning glare. Below, there was no sign of the carnage she'd witnessed. The scene was like something out of an oil painting, but Gretchen had come prepared and wriggled her way back under cover to assemble a leather looking-glass with a lens kept in her pouch. She held up a warning finger at her broom, which had begun twitching, and turned back to get a closer look. Stones had come loose since the bridge was built, and debris littered the banks of the stream. There was a shadow on the far side, hunched over, though most of it was obscured by what was possibly a makeshift wall. Quite the hidey-hole if you were into that kind of thing. A flash of movement drew her attention, but she couldn't get a clear view. She was starting to understand why the last guy got shredded. There was no way to approach the bridge unseen, and she couldn't be sure she hadn't already been spotted. If she hadn't just witnessed the troll haul his breakfast out of the air, she might have considered filling a goat with the potions and sending it in his general direction. But there was one more trick she had up her sleeve. Rolling clear out of view, she fumbled in her pouch for a stoppered bottle. "Let's hope this works. It cost me enough in ingredients." Muttering an incantation, she sat up, uncorked the bottle, and sprinkled its contents over her head. By the time she tucked it away, the bottle seemed suspended in the air, her arm shimmering to blend with the grassy green hill. Leaving her broom and looking-glass behind, she summoned the courage to stand and tread carefully down the slope, knowing her potion didn't account for the disruption of her footfalls. As she dipped into the small valley, the smell of blood and filth wafted toward her, and Gretchen pushed away the notion of being the creature's second course. She steeled herself as she moved, sliding out the potions, deciding on dousing whatever remained of his feast with the unknown cocktail. As she drew nearer, the shadowed features emerged into a wide, hairy beast. Its attentions were not on her, but fixed on chewing on an unidentifiable joint with a sickening crack. She took measured breaths as she crossed the distance, picking her way over rocks that formed part of the landscape close to the stream's edge. When she stepped into the shadow of the bridge, the creature whipped its head toward her, dropping the joint and grinning through gore straight at her. Gretchen screeched as it launched toward her, doing the first thing that came to mind. She hurled the bottles at its head and turned tail to run. A hiss came from behind her, and she slowed to look over her shoulder. The troll stopped, scrubbing at its eyes, yowling as steam rose from its face. The flimsy bottles had shattered. One vial dangled on the tip of a horn, and steam enveloped the troll, its heat warming Gretchen's face. She watched on, horrified, as the beast dropped to the ground, writhing in pain. Lordy, who'd have thunk that mix would be so corrosive? She explored her pockets for something that might ease the pain. She startled when a growl came from the ground. "How dare you?" The voice rasped as though from disuse, and Gretchen's eyes boggled. "You're enchanted." She backed away a few steps with her hands held up. "Listen, had I known I would have refused the job altogether." The steam had fizzled, and the troll raked fingers across its face before pushing to its feet. Gretchen had never heard of an enchanted troll before. But with the Treaty for Enchanted Folks a few years back, they got the same rights as people when it came to matters of assault and murder. "I wasn't enchanted." The words seemed to leave a bitter taste on its tongue. "What did you do to me?" Gretchen's mind reeled, and she stumbled to the bridge to lean against the volcanic rock. The ramifications of enchanting an animal, something only the top-tier wizards could claim within their powers, were mind-blowing. She'd thought that darn book was losing its marbles, but it had gifted her with creator-scale magic. "Does this mean?" Gretchen licked her lips and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Are you my minion now?" The troll hawked and spat on the ground, picking at its teeth with clumsy fingers. "I should rip you to shreds is what I should do. Here I was happily eating goat entrails, and you had to come and douse me with whatever that was. I mean, look at it, he waved at the bridge. Living under a mound of rocks in the mud like a toad. What was I thinking? The troll's shoulders sagged, and despite the threat, Gretchen felt pity for the newborn member of a human-dominated society. What's your name? Troll guy? I'm Gretchen, and I'm here because you've been chowing down on the locals' livestock. The troll tilted his head to consider the question as he stared at the remains of goat littered around. Jürgen, he said it deliberately, as if testing it on his tongue. That's as close as it sounds anyway. Listen, I'm sorry if I upset your little apple cart here. If it's any consolation, the folks around here have a bounty on your head, and enchanted is probably better than dead. She rubbed a hand across her face. If you need a place to crash, you're welcome back at my place, so long as you keep my cat's entrails where they're supposed to be. Jürgen cast sad eyes around the valley and shook his head. No, I don't belong here. I'll leave, find my way back to my own kind. Gretchen watched as Jürgen set off up the slope, unsure how to remedy the situation. She doubted he'd be happy among his family, but it wasn't like she could bundle him up and take him home. Chapter 4. Gretchen whistled as she left the mayor's house, jangling the generous purse of gold in her hand. A deal was a deal, and they wanted the troll gone. She hadn't gotten a lot of sleep after getting back from the bridge, but she put the enchantment down to blind luck. The gold was welcome in any case. She'd seen no sign of the girl seeking the love potion, and market day where she sold most of her goods was a ways off. Word must have travelled fast. The regular people of the town were smiling and nodding in her general direction as she walked home with a basket full of supplies. Usually she was invisible to the likes of them, an unpleasant necessity in the social order of things. Not that she minded most of the time. A fresh batch of cure-all was in order for the afternoon. Good for most afflictions, which included coughing and runny noses. It was by far her best seller. But the brew required a fair measure of an herb grown in the warmer climates of the south, which didn't come cheap. When she closed the cottage's door behind her, she frowned at Nora, who sat at her kitchen table. "And where have you been?" Bags hung under her eyes, and her head was propped in her hands. "Working." Gretchen dropped her basket on the table and leaned down to give Mulligan a scratch behind the ears. "You look like you haven't slept in days. That dwarf is losing his mind, absolutely senile. It's about time he went into a home, but he won't leave without someone to take care of the place." "No takers on the job front?" Gretchen hung a kettle over the hearth and reached for the tin of tea leaves. "We had a wood nymph come in for an afternoon, and she said something about leaf blight before scarpering." Gretchen snorted. "What about the city? Surely after all those protests about working conditions, there'd be someone looking for a taste of the countryside." "I sent a missive last week," Nora yawned. "There've been no inquiries. I don't suppose you're looking for some work on the side?" Gretchen fetched a tea set and weighed telling Nora about her encounter with Jürgen. It was unlikely she would keep her mouth shut about the affair, and Gretchen didn't relish the idea of a swarm of witches descending on her cottage to poke around in her spell book. A tap on the door saved her from having to reply. "You again?" The lovesick girl fidgeted with a small parcel on her threshold. "I've got the hair, like you said. How long before it's done?" Gretchen heaved a sigh, certain who the girl's quarry was, and felt reluctant to play a part in snaring him. "Tomorrow. You can't rush these things." The girl pressed the packet into Gretchen's hand and pulled her hood over her head before scurrying off. "Love potion? I stopped agreeing to do those years ago. Only ever leads to trouble." Gretchen rolled her eyes in agreement and set the tea to brew. "It was a tough week, but I already made a deal, as much as I hate to stitch Gavin up." "That fine young man? You'll do no such thing, Gretchen. He's been a saviour at the Salton Bog this week." Gretchen sank onto a chair and closed her eyes. "I'll think of something." Nora shuffled into the kitchen and started prattling about the goings-on at the tavern, and Gretchen listened with half an ear. The normal debacles transpired, which included food fights and unpaid tabs. As Nora pushed a teacup toward her, she smiled one of her sweetest smiles. "Are you sure you wouldn't consider taking over for a while? You never know. It may work out better for you there. Why, you could do a side trade of potions right on the premises. There are enough scuffs around the place to warrant a few bottles of stitching serum, and once they've knocked back a few ales, they're less likely to squabble over the price. Gretchen held her hand up to silence her. All right, I'll help out for a while, but you keep looking for someone to take over. I have no plans on settling in a dump like that. Nora sniffed as her eyes travelled over the run-down cottage. Very well, you can start tonight. It took 2 pots of tea and a considerable amount of moaning to get Nora out of the house. Gretchen assured her she would be along to the Salt and Bog later in the afternoon, and closed the door behind her with relief. A batch of Curé all would take too long to brew, so she stowed the ingredients safely in her cellar, with a promise to see to it in the morning, and cleared up the dishes. Her eye caught on the packet on the table. What do you think, Mulligan? A love potion for the girl, or do I save Gavin's skin and give her something else? She rubbed a hand over her face. And risk a major dent in my reputation. That girl looks lippy. Mulligan shot her a contemptuous look from his food dish, and Gretchen rolled her eyes. Full of sage advice, as usual, she filled his dish and pried the spell book from under the floor. She had a few pointed questions to ask and had been avoiding having them answered. The book was strangely subdued when she dropped it on her desk, and she had to coax it open with a tickle. Now, first things first, did you come up with those potions to enchant that troll, or was it some kind of coincidence? The page remained blank, and she puffed out her cheeks. I know, I hate to question your prowess and all. It's just that enchanting is well beyond most spell books. Almost as if gloating, the pages gave a stretch and settled back in place. All right, fine, it doesn't matter anyway. Now I need some help with a love potion. But, Gretchen held up a finger, not the regular kind. I want her to think it worked, but lets the poor sap off the hook. She clenched her teeth when the book showed no sign of moving, then squinted as a small sketch appeared in the middle of the page. It expanded all at once, and Gretchen took a step back as Jürgen's face rushed at her, teeth bared. She held a hand to her chest and sagged. The book shouldn't know what he looked like, and it didn't figure in with her assumption it was a fluke. She licked her lips and nodded. Okay, maybe I deserve that. Sorry I questioned you. Can we get back to the love potion dilemma? The pages snapped and flicked over with curly script emerging on the page. Most of the provisions were commonplace, but one in particular would cause her a lot of grief to get her hands on. Really? A toenail clipping? How on earth do you suppose I'm going to convince the guy to hand over any of those? The book quivered as if snickering, and Gretchen curled her lip and jotted the list down. Tucking her notebook into her pouch, she slammed the book shut and returned it to its resting place with barely a commotion on its part. Sinking into her sofa, she tipped her head back to stare at the ceiling. Dark patches bowed the ceiling alarmingly, and she cursed her leaky roof. She screwed her eyes shut and groaned. Every spring underneath her poked uncomfortably. There wasn't one piece of furniture in the cottage that hadn't been handed down for 3 generations. Maybe Nora was right. A new opportunity at the Salt and Bog might be just what she needed to crawl out of her hand to mouth existence. Even the coin from the mayor wouldn't last long if she didn't drum up some business. Heaving a sigh, she stood and headed for the door, deciding to get a head start on the afternoon trade at the Salt and Bog. If she was lucky, Gavin might let her talk him into a pedicure. The flight over was wet and miserable, and mud flicked into her face when she skidded to a halt in the bare patch around the back of the tavern. Grumbling, she thrust the broom in the rack by the door and scraped her boots before marching in. "Here so soon?" Nora looked up from her newspaper and had the decency to look sheepish. Gretchen narrowed her eyes at the filthy floor and scowled. "Still looking for job applicants, then?" Nora coughed and folded her newspaper as she scooted her stool back. "Paperboy just went by. Thought I'd have a quick look." She snapped her fingers and the broom in the corner stood to attention, then danced across the floors collecting grime. Gretchen pushed envy aside. She'd never managed to charm an object indefinitely, and the results were always unpredictable. She yanked a dishcloth from her belt that she hoped would take care of the kitchen on its own and stomped past the bar. With the brownie gone, the tavern has lost its lustre. Despite the work keeping on top of things, cobwebs gathered in dark corners and dust bunnies lurked behind the pots lined up on shelves. Gretchen put on a kettle and set the dishcloth to work with a sigh. A hacking cough came from the stairs, and Gretchen winced as she tipped extra herbs into the pot. When she'd rattled up the stairs with the tea tray, old Thomas called out from his room. "About time, Nellie. Don't know what I pay you for. I asked for tea hours ago." Gretchen's heart sank as she bumped the door open with her hip and sat the tray on the dwarf's nightstand. "Nellie's gone, Thomas. She left weeks ago." Thomas screwed up his wasted face and cast his eyes around the room. "Gretchen, what are you doing here?" A racking cough came. "This place has gone to the dogs, dust everywhere, and no tea cake, can you imagine?" "I'll get you some cake, Thomas." She reached to check his temperature and ignored his hands batting her away. "You're sick, you should be in a hospice. My herbs will only do so much." "I'm dying." There was a sudden clarity in his eye. "Let me expire in my own bed." Gretchen said nothing and poured his tea. He was right. No amount of medicine would cure the rot in his lungs. She didn't know how old he was, but she'd wager he had lived as long as any dwarf should. "The salt and bog is my legacy." He gripped her hand as she sat on the bed. "I know most dwarves think I'm eccentric, living above ground and all, but this place is a haven for folks like us, outcasts, those that don't fit in." Gretchen held the cup to his lips and ignored the guilt settling into her stomach. "Nora's looking for someone to come and take care of the place. If you want to see out your days here, we'll make it work somehow." Thomas sank back into his pillow and closed his eyes. Deciding against funneling the rest of the tea down his gullet, Gretchen sat the cup on the nightstand and left him to rest. She was pleased to see the dishcloth was still scrubbing away in the kitchen, and when she marched into the tap room, Nora had put a mop and feather duster to work. "I hear you'll be running the place soon." Gretchen startled at Gavin, who perched on his usual stool at the bar. "Is that so?" She narrowed her eyes at Nora. "Why would anyone sign up for something like this?" "It's not so bad." He waved his glass to encompass the room. "If you don't take up the offer, I just might do it myself." Gretchen guffawed, then noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "The silversmith business not treating you well." She reached for the brandy bottle under the bar. "I didn't give much thought to hired help when I bought the place. Figured there'd be plenty of lads who would want to pick up the trade. I don't need much. Just a strong arm and the ability to tell one end of a hammer from the other. Around here, they all seem to be dullards or farmers." "Or both," Gretchen shrugged. "But I have to agree, it's hard to get good help these days. With the king spending most of his time building new roads and public buildings, most of the youngsters leave for the big smoke once they're old enough." "Horrible place, the city." Gavin curled his lip. "Filled with dreadful people with cruel tongues." Gretchen pressed her lips together and poured him another. Poor Guy looked like he needed it. "Well, you should put your feet up. Guy like you is liable to get bunions the size of eggs on his feet. I have the perfect brew for that kind of thing, and I throw in a free foot rub with the deal." The broom clattered to the floor, and Nora stood in the middle of the room with her mouth agape. Gretchen shot her a meaningful look, but Gavin barely seemed to notice. "My feet are fine. It's my back that could use a rub. Not that I expect to get bunions there, but you never know." He swayed on his stool as he chuckled to himself, and Gretchen sighed. A better plan of attack would be filling him with enough brandy to turn him upside down. It didn't seem far off in any case. "Bottoms up, kid. The only back rub you're liable to get from me is with the business end of my broom." Chapter 5. He's what? Gretchen stood bleary-eyed at her door, clutching her teacup and holding her robe closed. "Wandering around the streets unclothed, frightening the good folk going about their business." The mayor shook with rage. "We don't even have any laws prohibiting such behaviour, and by the time I get it past the council—" All right. What do you want me to do about it?" "I paid you to get rid of that monster. You'll deal with it or hand back the coin." Gretchen opened her mouth to protest, but thought better of it. If the mayor got around town telling people she'd stiffed him, she wouldn't see another customer this side of Christmas. "I'll come and take a look, but really that guy is enchanted. He has rights under common law." The mayor bristled, clenching his fists at his side. "He can exercise his rights outside my town. People around here won't stand for his indecency." The mayor marched off down the path, and Gretchen closed the door with a sigh. She should have known Jürgen wouldn't get a warm welcome among his own kind. He was like a newborn babe, and was now her responsibility. Not that she thought he would accept any help she offered. Why can't things just be simple for once, Mulligan? Her familiar arched his back with a yawn and turned circles before settling back on his ratty blanket. Gretchen tittered and gulped the rest of her tea before padding to her bedroom to get dressed. With a fresh pair of hose and some water splashed on her face, she braided her hair with a mind to how she would tackle that problem. She had an old smock in her cellar, which she used when brewing her more caustic potions, and she stuffed it in her pouch along with a rope that could work as a belt. With a scratch behind Mulligan's ears, she marched out of her cottage and down the laneway toward town. The walk gave her some pondering time, and she hoped her ideas for Jürgen would pan out, providing he didn't shred her on sight. In town, more people than usual were milling about on the paved pathways, whispering in small groups with smirks. Nobody smiled and nodded her way that time, as she followed the path toward the town square. The menfolk stood around with arms crossed at the square's edge, and Gretchen shouldered past them to find Jürgen sitting slumped against the fountain, a despondent look on his face. "Back so soon?" Gretchen plastered a friendly smile on her face. "How about we get you back to my cottage while we figure out what to do with you?" Jürgen turned with a snarl, and Gretchen stopped short. "Keep walking, witch! This is all your fault, and I want no more of your concoctions." Gretchen held her hands up and grimaced. "No potions today, I promise. But if you don't come with me, those guys are likely to start sharpening their pitchforks. The fact of the matter is that to fit into polite society, you need to wear pants." Jürgen's eyes widened and looked down at his naked flesh as the concept of modesty seemed to catch up to him. He clutched his groin and reddened. "There you go. I've got just the thing." Gretchen retrieved the smock and rope from her pouch and tossed them to the mortified troll. She turned her back while he scrambled to cover his shame and winked at the onlookers who were still throwing surly looks her way. "This is excruciating. Sudden awareness of things I should know nothing about makes my head thump." Gretchen turned back toward Jürgen, who leaned against the fountain, hugging his arms across his chest. "My family shunned me. I have nowhere to go, and living under a bridge somehow doesn't seem appealing anymore. Yeah, well, funnily enough, I don't find that surprising." She nodded toward the street behind her. "Time to go find you a brand new life." Jürgen cast wary looks at the townsfolk and seemed to decide Gretchen was a better bet. He followed behind her as she cleared a path through the street. "Nothing to see here, fellas. Best be on your way. Everything is under control." She stopped short at a food cart, mindful of her lack of breakfast. The woman standing over the tray of pies shrunk away from the pair. "2 of those, if you will. And do you have any ale? It's a bit early, but I could sure use one." Gretchen winked at Jürgen. "The mayor promised whatever resources I needed." With trembling hands, the woman handed over the pies and drew 2 ales from a small cask underneath her cart. Gretchen took small sips as she leaned against a lamp-post, relishing in the discomfort of the people still lingering. Jürgen took a tentative whiff of the pie and devoured it in 2 bites. Grimacing, he gulped the ale and coughed. "That stuff is awful, greasy and close to rancid." He sniffed at the ale and upended the battered tin tankard onto the cobbles. And that ale must have soured weeks ago. Gretchen chortled at the indignant look on the pie woman's face and took a small bite from her own pastry. "Same crap as usual." She rolled her tongue over her teeth. "Who'd have thunk a troll's palate would be so discerning? And after witnessing you chowing down on goat entrails." Jürgen held his stomach with a grumble, and Gretchen set her ale back on the cart with a sigh. When she set off down the street, Jürgen's footfalls sounded close behind her. "Where are we going?" "I'd like you to meet someone." She grinned over her shoulder. "He doesn't seem to mind ale being sour after a few glasses of brandy." The silversmith's workshop was on the outskirts of town, where the sounds and smells of his enterprise didn't bother anyone. The old bell foundry had seen better days, and had been empty since the old craftsman had died. Gavin had bragged about getting the place for a pittance, and had grand plans for its future. He must have had vision, though, because Gretchen couldn't understand what he saw in the place. The old bell above the door didn't seem to alert Gavin to their presence, and Gretchen frowned and called out, "You who? You're not still recovering from last night, are you?" Gavin appeared from a back room and stared between Gretchen and Jürgen. He hadn't bothered to peel off his gloves and held a file at his sides. "I don't have time for house calls. I don't care how much brandy you brought with you." He looked Jürgen up and down. "Who's your friend?" Gretchen turned and puffed herself up with a smile. "This is your soon-to-be employee." Her face fell when Gavin's face screwed up. "Are you mad? That's the troll everyone's been complaining about." "An enchanted troll," Gretchen coughed. "A good citizen who's looking for honest work and food on the table." Gavin shook his head and turned back to his workshop. Gretchen followed on his heels and waved Jürgen along behind her. "I've just set up shop in this town. If it gets around that I have a troll in my employ, all of my business will go out the window." Gavin sunk on a stool by his workbench and continued filing a rough-cast knob. Gretchen narrowed her eyes and searched his tool chest beside him. "Now you said," she fished out a hammer, "that all you needed was someone with a strong arm who knew one end of a hammer from the other." She pressed the tool into Jürgen's palm and held his arm up. "I mean, just look at those hairy biceps. I'll bet he could swing that thing all day and night. Why, I saw him toss around a goat like it was a chew toy." Gavin dropped his file and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Look, I'm sure he's great. But this is a business decision. Why don't you send him off to the slaughterhouse with the ogres?" "Ogres?" Jürgen's eyes widened. "Ogres hunt trolls just for fun. One time I got stuck up a tree." Gavin held up a hand. "The point is, I can't have you here." Gretchen snatched the hammer from Jürgen and slammed it on the workbench. "I see. You don't mind hanging out with degenerates like us at the Salt and Bog, but you'd prefer to keep that under your hat. Are we an embarrassment? Shame on you. And here I was thinking you were different." Gavin cringed and sagged on his stool. "Besides," Gretchen huffed, "you haven't thought about the side benefits." Gavin quirked an eyebrow. "Think about it. You've been hiding from every mother in this town who is bent on playing matchmaker. Now why you aren't interested isn't my concern." She clucked her tongue. "I'm not here to judge. But with a troll in your household, I'm sure they'd think twice about packing their daughter off to live here. A troll at the table for Christmas would be unfathomable for the likes of them." Gavin sighed, but his eyes were calculating. "Folks around here don't care who does the dirty work, as long as it's not them. Keep Jürgen out back and make sure it's your handsome mug they see when they come in to splash their gold around." Gavin leaned back to stare at the ceiling and groaned. "All right, fine, he has a week to prove his worth." He looked Jürgen up and down. "But you need to get him some pants." "Terrific!" Gretchen held up her arms with a grin. "You won't regret this. I'll stitch him a tunic and hose right away." Jürgen scratched at his neck, but looked relieved at his new appointment. "You can start by bringing in firewood from out the back." Gavin nodded toward the door. "I assume you know how to tend a fire." Jürgen grumbled an assent and trudged out in his smock. Gavin turned to Gretchen with a grimace. "If he doesn't work out, it's up to you to find him someplace to go. And next time you foist enchanted creatures on some poor soul, remember to bathe them first." "You got it." Gretchen gave a mock salute and turned to the door. "About last night?" Gretchen spun on her heel and cocked her head. "You didn't, rub my feet, did you?" He squirmed on his stool. Gretchen refrained from patting her pouch and guffawed. "Nah, that was one of the gnomes," she winked. "With his tongue, if memory serves. You should lay off the hard stuff. We've got another batch of ale coming this afternoon." Gretchen left him looking mortified and kept from cackling until she was back on the street. One problem solved. She'd have just enough time to get the love potion brewed before she was needed at the Salt and Bog. Chapter 6. "My home!" Gretchen screeched. "Mulligan, where are you?" Her living room was in ruins. The ceiling had finally given out under the pressure of the leaky roof and collapsed over her furniture. Her coat stand had gone through a window, and the wind whistling in stirred white dust across the debris. Gretchen cast around frantically. "Where are you, Furball? You better not be a cat-pat under there somewhere." She started hauling the splintered remains of her dining table aside. When she heard a familiar squeak, she dropped a chair leg and stumbled to her bedroom. "Mulligan!" She squatted to the floor and craned her head to get a view of the feline who cowered under her bed. "Thank the heavens above!" Her purple cat crawled into her arms, and she sat slumped, stroking his back, as she stared at the wreckage. She knew the spells she'd put in place as a stopgap were flimsy, but she'd been in no position to get the roof repaired, and even with the coin from the mayor there was no way she could undo that mess. "Why me, Mulligan?" she sniffled. "Why can't things just go my way for once?" Mulligan rubbed his face against her cheek, an uncharacteristic show of affection, and Gretchen's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Maybe Nora was right. She would never get ahead in this hovel selling potions for a pittance to customers who were few and far between. There was no shortage of customers at the Salt and Bog, and at least the place wouldn't come down around her ears. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's get out of here." She was hauling a trunk through her door with what she could scavenge from her stores when the girl startled her. "Is the potion ready?" She stood further down the path, wringing her hands, craning her neck to see past Gretchen to her living room. Gretchen closed her eyes and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She wanted nothing more than to tell the girl to scram, but she wasn't in a position to turn her down. Besides, she owed it to Gavin to get her off his tail. "Come by the Salt and Bog this afternoon. I've had some trouble with my cauldron." The girl eyed her askance, but said nothing, and trotted back down the lane, presumably to whatever errands her parents thought she was running. Gretchen reached for her broom and held it down to strap on the trunk, praying that the handle didn't snap on the ride over. She fetched a basket, and with Mulligan safely stowed inside, she snapped her fingers at her vehicle to follow her as she set out for the tavern on foot. She checked herself at the gate and called the broom to a stop, the spellbook, under a mountain of rubble. She didn't know how she could possibly get it out on her own, and made a mental note to conscript the ogres into some heavy lifting when she had a few coins to spare, or maybe just a few favours. Scrubbing a hand across her face, she set off again. It was a few miles up and down hills, and Gretchen shifted the basket onto her shoulder with a sigh. The dark clouds began drizzling during the trip, and Gretchen shivered when she caught sight of the Salt and Bog, a welcome plume of smoke drifting up from its chimney. The broom skidded ahead of her to drop by the door, and Gretchen felt lighter as she picked up her pace to get inside. As she wrestled her things over the threshold, the sound of a stool scraping over the floors told her the racket had roused Nora. "Moving in, then?" The smug look was wiped from Nora's face when she saw Gretchen's tear-stained face. "What happened?" Gretchen slammed the door and dropped the basket to a table, where Mulligan peered out from under his blanket. Her shoulders sagged, and she drew a ragged breath. "The darn roof caved in. I thought the leak wasn't so bad, not that I could do much about it, and now my cottage looks like a war zone." She sniffed and rushed on. "And now I have to get that potion brewed for the girl, organise some pants for that troll, and the brewery said they were bringing more ale by this afternoon. And just look at this place. It's the same every day, and if they think I'll stand for it when I'm running the place—" "Hush." Nora held a hand up and took her elbow to steer her toward the kitchen. "Let's get you by the fire to warm up, and we can sort this out one problem at a time." Gretchen clamped her mouth shut and allowed Nora to push her to a stool with a warm cup of tea pressed into her palm. "Now, you said something about a potion." Nora fetched a small cauldron from a shelf. "I wrote it down." Gretchen fumbled in her pouch for her notebook and opened it carefully to the page marked with Gavin's toenail clippings. "I hope this thing works." Nora squinted at the page. Her mouth turned to a wry smile, and she set it on the bench. "Looks promising." She trotted to the pantry and called out while rummaging through bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "Now what happened to your roof?" Gretchen took a small sip of tea and exhaled. "It's been leaking for a while now. I made a few charms, which I thought were holding for the most part. I just didn't have the cash to get it fixed properly. It's hopeless. I have no choice but to move in here." "Well, I'll hardly talk you out of it." She collected a knife on her way back to the cauldron. "Why don't you go upstairs and see Thomas? I'm sure he has old trunks up there with clothes for your troll, was it? How'd you get roped into that job?" Gretchen recounted her troubles with Jurgen and his new job with Gavin, leaving out the part where she'd enchanted him. "An enchanted troll living under a bridge?" Nora let out a low whistle. "Things must have been desperate for the poor fella. Can't say I ever heard of a troll being enchanted, but it's possible it could be some kind of hybrid." Gretchen pushed her stool out from behind her and set the teacup down before she got drawn into an involved conversation on the subject. "I'll take Thomas some tea." She rounded up a tray in short order and carried it up the stairs. Thomas was sleeping fitfully when she reached his room, and Gretchen gave his hand a squeeze as she sat on the bed beside him. He stirred, eyes blinking open. "Gretchen, where's Nellie?" Gretchen smoothed the wispy hair over his forehead. His decline was hard to swallow. He looked years older than he seemed just a couple of days ago. "She's gone, Thomas. I will take care of you now." She poured him a cup and pushed an extra pillow under his head. "About time, too. I don't know how you get by selling those tonics of yours. Most of them don't work. You know that, don't you?" Gretchen bit her tongue and shook her head. "It doesn't matter anymore. I'll keep the place running, and you can just put your feet up until you're well." He wheezed, holding a hand to his chest. "I'll be right as rain. Just you see. Where's Nellie? I told that brownie I wanted some supper hours ago." Gretchen licked her lips and sighed. "I'll get her to send some right up." She left him to his tea, feeling too fragile to talk in circles with the senile dwarf. The hallway was dusty. She needed to bring Nora's broom up there, and she followed it down to the old guest rooms Thomas used to let out before the problems he had with squatters. The brownie had been vigilant, though, and while the rooms weren't spotless, there was no musty smell as she rifled through old wardrobes looking for something that would fit Jürgen. She could get used to a place like that. If not for dealing with the mob downstairs, it would be considered a step up from her digs. With a green woolen tunic and hose in reasonable condition draped over her arm, she trod downstairs where Nora had the cauldron simmering over the fire. "That should only need a few more minutes. Now that you're here, I have pressing business with the Baron." Nora tossed a dishcloth into the sink. Gretchen's mouth gaped, but she didn't reprimand the witch for bailing on her. She'd likely been at the Salt and Bog for days, and her employer couldn't be all that forgiving of her absences. "Just leave the mop and broom, will you?" Nora flashed a winning smile and grabbed the clothes from Gretchen's arms. "Deal. I'll even run these over for you. Wouldn't mind clamping eyes on this troll anyhow." It was one less thing she had to deal with. If Nora found out about the circumstances of his enchantment, well, she would deal with that when it happened. Gretchen saw Nora out to collect her things from the doorway, and with a little help from the mop and broom, got them all upstairs in her new room. Leaving mop and broom to tidy up, she went about the business of preparing for impending customers. She was wondering where the brewery cart was when the bell above the door jingled. "Hello?" The girl's nose protruded around the door, and she took a hesitant step into the tavern. Gretchen wagered she'd never set foot in a place like that before. With a mind to the cauldron still simmering over the fire, she called out as she scuttled into the kitchen. "Come in, I'm around the back." She used tongs to swing the brew out of the hearth and thanked her lucky stars it hadn't burned dry. A small puddle of vivid green burbled in the bottom. "That's it!" The girl's eyes were wide as she stood in the doorway. "Everything you ever wanted." Gretchen waved at a stool. "Sit down, kid. It will take a few minutes to cool." The girl perched on the very edge of the stool and looked set to leap off at any second. Gretchen took pity on her. "What's your name, girl?" She settled on the stool across from her and planted a warm smile on her face. "Sarah." She swallowed as she stared into the pot. "Sarah." Gretchen gave a nod. "Now, we haven't had a chance to properly discuss all this, have we? Are you sure this is what you really want?" Sarah's eyes whipped toward her and melted as she considered the question. "There's nothing I've ever wanted as much as him." Gretchen poured the potion into a small jar, searching for the right words. "It's just, well, when we're young sometimes, we're certain we know what we want." Gretchen rubbed her chin. "And later, I mean, hindsight is a powerful thing. But by taking this potion, I'm certain." She set her jaw and there was a challenge in her eyes. "I will have him, one way or another." Gretchen clicked her teeth shut and didn't feel so bad about the ruse. She pushed the jar toward her and pressed her fingertips together. "Okay, you drink that potion and your dreams come true." Sarah's eyebrows drew together and she flashed a suspicious glare at her. "Me? Isn't he supposed to drink it? I've heard how these things are done." Gretchen waved a hand and clucked her tongue. "Maybe with those other washed-up hacks. I brew the real deal. Nope, it's you that drinks it. And when you get close enough, he won't be able to resist your musk. Musk is how the animal kingdom functions. Not a creature born that didn't begin with a good whiff between the parties. Of course, this is more sophisticated. Only he will find your aroma. Sarah tossed back the potion and slammed the jar on the table. She swallowed with a grimace and her face became glazed. Gotcha, Gretchen muttered under her breath. She cleared away the evidence and returned to her seat. Sarah sat transfixed for a few minutes before blinking a few times to regain focus. She looked around at the kitchen and startled when she met Gretchen's eye. I need to... She ran a tongue over her teeth with a grimace. It's not too late to cancel that love potion, is it? I don't know what I was thinking. That man is disgusting. I don't know why the others think he's so special. Gretchen smacked her lips and shrugged. Already brewed, I'm afraid. 3 gold coins. I agreed to 2, she huffed, and I don't even want it any more. Gretchen drummed her fingers on the table and leaned back. Well, I mean, fair is fair. If you don't want the potion, that's your business. But I won't let it go to waste. I could always put something in the paper, second-hand love potion for sale, for any Sarahs looking to swindle a Gavin. Sarah hissed and reached into her pouch for a fistful of coins. She slammed them on the table as she stood and turned on her heel to rush out the door. Chuckling, Gretchen rummaged through the assorted pile of things. Aside from a button and thimble, she plucked out 2 gold coins and 5 of silver. It was close enough. Chapter 7. Things didn't turn out so bad when the ale didn't arrive. Gretchen had called it a night at a reasonable hour after the regulars left grumbling about the price of the top-shelf stuff. But by the sullen look on the ogres' faces, it wasn't going to wash today. What's the point of a tavern if it doesn't have any ale? The ogre with the particularly snubbed nose scowled. He assured me he'd come by in a couple of hours. Gretchen wiped down the bar. A broken axle, apparently. Now, unless you want to go over there and haul it here yourselves, I suggest you shut your traps. The ogres muttered among themselves, and one drew out a pack of lacquered cards and began shuffling. Gretchen took a deep breath and trod to the kitchen to fetch some meals. At least the baker hadn't stopped delivering. "Nellie!" Thomas's hoarse voice carried down the back stairs. "Where's my tea cake?" Gretchen cringed and ground her teeth as she set up a tray. She fervently hoped the dwarf had his nightshirt on when she got up there. The old goat seemed more inclined to nudism in his senile state. "Coming!" she hollered. After setting Thomas up and slicing a pie to take out to the ogres, Gretchen heard the creaking of a cart outside. "Finally," she muttered, waving away the ogres who had stood to greet the ale. She had her hand on the doorknob when it burst open. Gavin stood on the threshold, propping up Jurgen with an arm under his shoulders. "He's hurt." "Nora told me you were here." Gretchen backed up and snapped her fingers back at the ogres. "Tables!" They stared at Gavin's burden in shock until she stomped the floor with a hiss. "Hurry!" 2 of the ogres manhandled Jurgen off the sagging Gavin, and the others pushed tables together to lay him out in the middle of the tap room. Gretchen elbowed her way past and stared down at her patient to assess the damage. It was the acid, I think. Blew up like a bladder and dropped to the floor. Can't breathe. I unbuttoned his collar. Gretchen ignored Gavin's rambling and held her ear to Jurgen's mouth to listen to his whistling breath. His entire face was swollen, and if it shut down his airways entirely... She launched from the table through the back and up the stairs to her room. Thankfully, she hadn't gotten around to unpacking, and her trunk lay open on the floor with her stores scattered around. She plucked a vial of yellow liquid from the mess and flew back down to the bar. Gavin and the ogres stood back motionless as they stared at the inflated troll. Uncorking the potion with her teeth, she held Jurgen's head back and tipped the contents down his gullet. She rubbed his neck, willing the brew not to choke him, and waited. The gurgling was a good sign. It meant some air was getting through, but his face was turning purple, and Gretchen muttered a prayer. "Will he be okay?" Gavin stepped in close and swallowed. She didn't answer, and the seconds dragged on before Jurgen's chest rattled and he gasped. Gretchen sagged with relief and dropped to a stool. "Give him some time. The swelling should go down soon." She swiveled to stare at the ogres muttering among themselves. "And you lot can mind your manners. This troll is enchanted, so there'll be none of your usual sport." They slunk back to their seats, their muttering becoming more animated, though Gretchen didn't understand any of it. They used their own language when keeping to themselves, and Gretchen had never bothered to learn it. Her tongue didn't have the dexterity to master their syllables. Taking a few slow breaths, she stood and rolled her neck as she sidled around the bar. Although the brandy was almost cleared out, there were a few bottles of a good vintage that had been scoffed at when Gretchen read out the price. She poured two and handed one to Gavin. "Had I known... well, I had a bad feeling about it, is all I'm saying." He threw back the liquor and grimaced. "I appreciate you giving him a chance." She took a smaller sip of her own drink. "There was no way we could have known he'd be allergic to... what was it?" "Borax. An acid we use to protect silver against scorching." "He'll be okay." Gretchen patted his shoulder. "We'll find him something else." Gavin tore his eyes away from the troll, who appeared to be breathing easier, and sank to his usual stool. "And what happened to you? Nora said something about your cottage falling over." "Not exactly," Gretchen sighed. "The roof came down. I've decided to set up shop here." Gavin gave her a level stare and shrugged. "If you say so, but you spent most of your time here trying to kick us out so you can get home." Gretchen snorted. "And that probably won't change. Only difference is that home is upstairs now." The sounds of squabbling arrived ahead of the gnomes, and they were only silenced when they stopped short to stare at Jurgens sprawled across their usual table. Gretchen waved them toward a spot by the fire. "Nothing to see here, boys. I've got a nice little table over here for you. Have you eaten? The ale hasn't arrived yet, but the pies in the back are still warm." She circled around them and shooed the cluster toward the fire. "What is that?" They swarmed around the table, poking and sniffing, one gnome with a tongue reaching toward Jurgen's ear. They scattered when one of them let out a yelp, its hand crushed in Jurgen's fist. "He'll bite back, I'm warning you," Gretchen smirked. "Even if he's unconscious." She checked his temperature and heart rate as the gnomes sat across the room. Each stool turned so they could keep watch on the troll. Jurgen's colour looked better, and already his face had shrunk to a familiar size. He groaned when she lifted his eyelid back and swatted at her hand, a good sign that the recovery would be swift. Gretchen went to fetch more meals along with a tatty blanket to throw over his bulk. "Do you think he could stay here?" Gavin took a bite of his pie and pointed with his fork. "I dunno," Gretchen exhaled. "I have a dwarf upstairs to take care of. I'm not sure this place can handle another mouth to feed, or if he has the temperament to put up with this lot." Instead of eating, the gnomes tore pieces of pastry and tossed them at the troll with excited whispers. Gretchen glowered, and they squeaked and turned away, their heads close as they chattered. The sound of another cart pulling up, this time with the familiar call of the driver to his horses, was met with cheers from the regulars. About bloody time. Gretchen dusted her hands and marched to the door. Accepting the delivery was more complicated than Gretchen expected, with the driver tallying up the barrels and giving her different prices for each batch. Unsure how much she needed, she took all the cheap stuff and two of the others, with a handful of gold from the chest Thomas kept in his room. When the driver unloaded, rolling barrels in through the door, Gretchen's eyes widened as a pie sailed across her vision, knocking a tankard from an ogre's hand. It was met with a rumbling growl. "Oh, not again!" Gretchen pushed past the driver into the tavern to hold up her hands between the parties. "Enough!" A pie exploded on her cheek, and the shouts turned to barking laughter. Her knees gave out when another barrel smacked into her calves, and she toppled onto her backside, rolling clear of the next barrel, following close behind it. Staring up at the ceiling, she watched as food flew past, knowing there was no coming back from there. Vulgar jeers rose above screeching and laughter, and when she rolled to her side, she caught sight of an ogre hefting a barrel overhead. No! Everything slowed. Gavin's cup dropped to the floor. A table was upended. The ogre leaned back to launch the barrel across the room. A pie smacked him in the face. The barrel dropped on his feet, and he yowled in pain. "What is going on in here?" Jurgen sat bolt upright on the table and brought his fist down with a thud. With his fangs exposed, he snarled at the ogres and whipped around to glare at the gnomes. Everybody stopped, some with projectiles held aloft. Jurgen's feet hit the floor with a thud, and he drew himself up to full height to survey his surroundings. "You better clean up this crap before I wipe the floor with all of you." He held his hand to his head with a wince. Gretchen wasn't sure if it was shock, shame, or fear of the unknown, but the gnomes and ogres backed away to their tables. The wagon driver stood frozen in the doorway, and the ogre with the sore toe stooped to carry a barrel to the stand by the far wall. All the patrons followed suit, and Gretchen sat dumb watching the ruffians shuffle around writing tables and chairs and picking up mess from the floor. Jurgen gave a nod and sank to a stool, cradling his head. How'd you do that?" Gretchen shuffled toward the troll and looked up at him from the floor. "What happened?" Jurgen took deep breaths and swallowed with a wince. "Allergic reaction. Gavin brought you right over." Jurgen blinked and turned toward the bar where Gavin stood watching them. "The last thing I remember was dipping the silver." Gretchen gave his knee a pat and pursed her lips. "I'm afraid silversmithing isn't going to agree with you." She pushed herself to her feet and sat beside the troll, marvelling at a pair of gnomes working in tandem with a brush and shovel. She gave a nod to the driver, who tipped his hat and scurried toward his wagon, and smothered a smirk at an ogre crawling around collecting his scattered cards from the floor. "What am I going to do?" Jurgen stared straight ahead, seemingly at nothing. I think I could use a pair of hands around here. If you keep them this well behaved, there's a good chance I'll have enough time to keep up with brewing potions." She paused. "I don't think it'll be easy, but we'll make it work." "Drink?" Gavin had made himself useful and proffered 2 tankards of ale at them. Gretchen swallowed a healthy dose, and Jurgen gave his ale a sniff. "I hope you didn't pay too much for these. I'll wager these casks are a week at most from souring." Gretchen barked a laugh. "You know, I think you'll be the only one that notices." Chapter 8. Gretchen swatted at Mulligan's claws as they tugged at her braid. "Enough! Go get Jurgen if you want some milk." Her eye cracked open and promptly closed at the light streaming in from the window. The feline hopped onto her chest and nuzzled her cheek. "All right, I'll get up. Get off me, you big lump." Mulligan launched off her belly onto the floor, and Gretchen wiped at imagined hair tickling her nose. She pulled a robe around her nightgown and slipped her feet into knitted slippers. Smothering a yawn as she stumbled out of her room, she noted a distinct lack of coffee aroma in the hallway. She frowned. In the week since he moved in, they'd fallen into a routine of sorts. At least Jurgen knew if he had coffee brewed in the morning, Gretchen was far more amicable throughout the day. The later nights and the sleepier mornings didn't agree with Mulligan, but he had taken to the troll faster than Gretchen had expected. She tiptoed past Thomas's bedroom, lest he started hollering for his tray, knowing from experience that she couldn't face his nonsense before she'd had at least 1 coffee. At home she usually drank tea, but it seemed Jurgen's refined palate was only one of many talents emerging for the troll, who was quickly coming to terms with his new existence. When she padded down the stairs into the empty kitchen, she stuck her head into the bar with a frown. A fire had already been set, the floors were clean, but the place was empty. Unable to reckon with what appointments a week-old person could have at this hour, she filled the kettle and swung it over the hearth. With Mulligan threatening to trip her over winding his way around her legs, she poured milk into a saucer and made a start on the breakfast tray to take upstairs. "Halloo!" Nora's footfalls sounded in the bar. "What is she doing here so early?" Gretchen muttered, setting the kettle down with a thump. "I'm out here." Nora clucked her tongue as she sauntered in the kitchen and collected the tray from the bench. She went to make off with it upstairs, and Gretchen turned to her with a frown. "And when do you volunteer to babysit, Thomas?" "Oh, hush. You need to fix yourself a tea and get properly dressed," she tittered. "In your nightclothes at this hour." Gretchen bit back a sharp reply about the times she had roused Nora in the bar well past noon. "What in tarnation is going on?" "You'll see." Nora winked and bustled up the stairs, leaving Gretchen with her mouth agape. With a teacup in hand, she trotted up past Thomas's closed door and pulled on a fresh pair of hose and a cleanish dress. Something was in the wind, and she planned on finding out just what that was. When she returned to the kitchen, Nora looked like she wanted to hop from one foot to the other. "You going to tell me what this is about?" Nora clapped her hands and grinned. "I think I should show you. It's a beautiful morning out there. We should enjoy it from the sky." Knowing she wouldn't get anything clearer from her, Gretchen waved her toward the door. Her broom had collected a fine layer of dust on the rack outside, and she gave it a cursory wipe with her sleeve. Nora didn't bother waiting, and Gretchen had to scramble after her as she launched into the air. As usual, with Nora's broom around, her own vehicle was on its best behaviour. The wind whipping against her face was invigorating, pushing away the echoes of sleepiness and her grouchy mood. She let her broom take its cues from Nora and screeched as she turned in a loop ahead of her. When she was upright again, she took control and zoomed past with a wave which almost toppled Nora, who was cackling from her perch. They clowned around for a while, spinning around each other before Nora pointed to the patchwork of fields below. They'd gone a lot higher than Gretchen had realised, and she turned lazy circles in a downward spiral. The colours of the crops resolved into a familiar pattern, and the velocity couldn't account for all butterflies in Gretchen's belly. Nora took them, sweeping down the laneway toward her old cottage, and landed neatly in her yard. It took all Gretchen's concentration to avoid crash landing in the hive of industry that was her garden. Swallowing what she hoped wasn't a fly, she held her hips and drew in ragged gasps. The patrons of the salt and bog marched in and out of her home with tools and buckets of plaster. A line of 4 gnomes carried a timber beam in through the door, and even the wood elves, who were less regular at the tavern, crawled around on her roof with fresh armfuls of thatch. "Are they—" Gretchen turned watery eyes to Nora. "You've been a miserable wretch. They were sick of the sight of you." Nora snickered and waved. Gavin was pointing and pantomiming to the nymphs, who seemed more concerned with tending to Gretchen's small vegetable garden. He threw up his hands with a shake of his head and ambled over with a wide grin. "What do you think?" "I just can't." Gretchen licked her lips. "I don't know how I'll ever be able to repay you." A younger lad, the mayor's son if memory served, came up behind Gavin and gave him a playful swat. "Slacking off already?" Gavin's face brightened. As he turned, the pair shared a look that was unmistakable. "Gretchen, meet my new assistant, Terry." "We've met, the mayor's son?" Terry nodded with a smile before swinging back to Gavin. "We need a little help with the beam." "I'll be there in a minute." Gavin's mouth twitched in a smile, and Terry trotted back to the house. "He seems nice." Gretchen fought the smirk that threatened to break her composure. "It couldn't have worked out any better." He rubbed his hands together and looked to the ground. I heard what you did about that girl and the love potion. I just wanted to say, well, I'm glad you didn't give it to her, even if it meant getting me drunk and stealing my toenails." "You're welcome," Gretchen snorted. "But I'll have you know I did not rub your feet." "That's okay. I've got a guy for that now." He winked and skipped back to the house before Gretchen could dish out a sharp reply. "He seems nice." Nora tied off a bulging pouch of greenery, helping herself from Gretchen's garden again, and fastened it to her broom. "The mayor's son." Gretchen raised her eyebrows. It took a second for realization to dawn on Nora's face. "But isn't he?" "He is." Gretchen gave a satisfied nod. "They make a lovely couple if you ask me. I'd like to see anyone try to give them any trouble about it with the mayor in office." Nora gave a wistful sigh and leaned on her broom. "You see? This is why I don't deal in love potions. Just think about the damage you would have done to that poor man if you'd meddled." Gretchen screwed up her face and rounded on her older companion. "Oh, and I suppose being a guru on hexes is perfectly savoury, is it?" Nora harumphed, and Gretchen rolled her eyes as she turned back to the house. Jurgen emerged from the doorway with a grin. "Almost done, come and see." He waved her toward the door, and Gretchen held a hand to her mouth as she crossed the threshold. The debris from the cave-in had been cleared, and Nellie, the brownie of all people, was rushing around with a bucket filled with rags and feather dusters. "Gretchen!" she exclaimed, rushing over to envelop her in a hug. "I came as soon as I heard. What a state the place was in." "Nellie!" Gretchen held her at arm's length and looked her up and down. "How's school going?" "Fabulous. By the time I've graduated, I'll have the lichen cleaned from every stone on that building." She waved a hand. "I just don't know how they live like that. Creative types, I mean. It's just no excuse for sloppy living. Gretchen chuckled as she shook her head and let the brownie out of her grip. She kept nattering away, but by now her attention was fixed on a spot above the fireplace, which she scrubbed at with a brush. "Do you like it?" Jürgen's hand rested on her shoulder and she heaved a deep breath. "I've never been happier to be home in all my life." She glanced up at the troll. "But won't you miss me, even when Thomas is calling out for a sponge bath?" "Not even a little bit." Jürgen barked a laugh, and she gave him a sharp poke in the ribs. "Thomas and I have an understanding, and the salt and bog will be under control." "Well, you won't be rid of me that easily." Thank you for joining me on this magical expedition through Troll Hunter Witch for Hire. I hope the enchanting twists and turns left you as captivated as it did me. If you haven't already, subscribe to my channel for more fantastical journeys. Share your thoughts on this mystical adventure or recommend your favourite magical reads in the comments below. Your insights make this bookish community truly magical. If you enjoyed our journey today, give this video a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all things fantastical right here. Until next time, may your books be filled with wonder and your days with magic. Happy reading!